October in Vermont is often described as serene. Cool air weaving through the amber and crimson leaves, mountain trails welcoming hikers seeking solitude. But in 2021, that calm was disrupted by a case that would rattle a community and raise chilling questions about the reality behind seemingly peaceful domestic lives. Emily Ferlazzo, a 22-year-old woman from New Hampshire, had set off on what should have been a simple celebratory road trip. Alongside her was her husband, Joseph Ferlazzo, 41, as they journeyed in a converted camper van to mark 1 year of marriage. The two had been together for several years before marrying in 2020, and outwardly, nothing about their relationship raised alarms, at least not to the casual observer. They chose Bolton, a quiet rural town in Vermont surrounded by forest and winding mountain roads. Isolated but picturesque, it was the kind of place people retreat to when they want to disconnect from daily life. It would become instead the location of a disappearance that rapidly evolved into a criminal investigation. Joseph returned from the trip alone. It was Monday, October 18th. No public alert had yet been issued, and Joseph didn't immediately report Emily missing. Instead, he drove back to New Hampshire without her and remained silent. Days passed, no contact, no sign of Emily. Then, finally, a relative grew concerned and contacted authorities. Emily was officially listed as a missing person. Her phone, purse, Idaho, everything she normally carried, were reportedly left behind in the camper. There was no note, no farewell message, no digital footprint suggesting she had chosen to disappear. Yet, according to Joseph, she had walked off after an argument and never returned. It was a narrative that failed to hold. Emily's family refused to accept it. They knew her routines, her fears, her struggles. She was close to her parents, and there was no way, no scenario, they could imagine where she would leave behind everything and vanish voluntarily. She had struggled with anxiety in the past, but she was not impulsive. The couple's relationship, according to those who knew them, had shown signs of strain, but nothing public, nothing violent, at least not openly. But the inconsistencies started to emerge. Why had Joseph waited days before saying anything? Why hadn't he called police immediately after Emily failed to return to their camper? And most importantly, why had he driven back across state lines alone without alerting anyone? Vermont State Police began to piece together the timeline. They interviewed Joseph, who gave a calm but vague recounting. Emily had left on foot after an argument near their camper in the early hours of the morning. He claimed he waited for her, then eventually drove off without seeing her again. It was a weak foundation for a missing person story. The investigators noted the lack of emotion in his delivery, the absence of urgency. Something felt off, not in the form of an obvious outburst or visible guilt, but in the way small details shifted each time he repeated them. Meanwhile, officers searched the area near the Bolton trailhead where the camper had been parked. No signs of Emily, no footprints leading away, no witnesses, and yet the camper, a vehicle that was supposed to carry memories of a peaceful anniversary, sat still, silent, and waiting to be examined. Inside, something would soon reveal that this wasn't just a disappearance. This was something darker. The camper wasn't empty. It was holding secrets. Detectives requested access to the van, which had since returned with Joseph to New Hampshire. The investigation transitioned quickly from a missing persons report to a full criminal inquiry. It would not take long before suspicion escalated into hard evidence, and evidence into arrest. But in this first chapter of the case, the mystery still loomed. Emily Ferlazzo was gone. Her husband had no convincing explanation. The forest, quiet as always, held no answers. But the camper did. And so, the investigation began, not only into the disappearance of a woman, but into the very nature of a relationship that had, until then, appeared unremarkable. What happened on that trip? What was said in that final argument? And why had Joseph, her husband of just 1 year, returned alone, empty-handed, and unmoved? These questions, and the silent weight of that forest, would soon lead detectives to an answer far more disturbing than anyone was prepared for. The moment a missing persons report is filed, investigators often face a crucial fork in the road. Is this an isolated vanishing, or is there something more deliberate underneath the surface? In the case of Emily Ferlazzo, Vermont State Police quickly sensed they were dealing with the latter. What made the case disquieting wasn't the theatrics often seen in true crime media, no calls from a frantic partner, no conflicting stories from multiple witnesses. It was the absence of all that. A woman had vanished in a remote forested area, yet no search party had been organized, No flyers were posted, no panic. Her husband Joseph had simply driven home. Emily was officially reported missing not by Joseph, but by a concerned relative. That distinction mattered. It spoke volumes. In a situation where minutes could mean life or death, the person closest to her had waited days, seemingly unbothered, to acknowledge she was gone. It set off a quiet alarm for detectives trained to spot emotional disconnects. Investigators began to dig deeper, not just into the trip to Vermont, but into the lives that led up to it. Emily Marie Ferlazzo, born in 1999, was known by friends as compassionate, energetic, and deeply trusting. She had studied to be a nurse and often volunteered in animal care. She was a private person, not inclined to overshare, but those close to her noticed changes after her relationship with Joseph deepened. Family and friends recalled subtle shifts. She became less available, harder to reach. Messages went unanswered for days. When asked how things were going, she'd smile and brush it off. Occasionally, she would share a quiet concern about arguments, intense, personal, and emotionally heavy, but nothing ever rose to the level of police involvement. To those on the outside, her life didn't seem dangerous. To those on the inside, it felt like walking on eggshells. Joseph was nearly 2 decades older than Emily. A former mechanic with a background in construction work, he didn't draw much attention to himself. There were no official records of violence, no red flags on paper. But emotional control doesn't always leave a paper trail, and that was the challenge investigators faced, understanding what wasn't documented. As they canvassed family members and spoke with acquaintances, patterns emerged, not just about behavior but about isolation. Emily had recently been spending more time at home. Her social media activity dwindled. When she did appear online, it was often carefully curated, smiling beside Joseph, captioned with optimism. There were no visible cries for help, but there was a quiet erosion of independence. One friend later shared a message Emily had written weeks before the trip. It was short but heavy in implication. Things aren't always what they look like. I just want peace. No context, no follow-up. Yet in hindsight, it echoed like a warning unheard. Investigators knew better than to take missing person cases at face value, especially when inconsistencies began to pile up. Why would someone in an emotionally fragile relationship choose to celebrate their anniversary in the middle of nowhere? Why hadn't Joseph contacted anyone in the hours after her disappearance? Why had he told conflicting versions of where she was last seen? Each question made the story thinner. The longer Joseph stayed silent, the louder the doubt became. The camper van, now back in New Hampshire, would soon be subject to a full forensic inspection. But before that, police needed to understand the timeline, down to the hour. They pulled data from phone records, GPS systems, and surveillance footage in the area surrounding Bolton. They spoke with locals, campgrounds, businesses, asking a key question. Had anyone seen Emily Ferlazzo after October 16th? No one had. Emily's parents were increasingly vocal in the press. Her mother, sobbing in a televised interview, said, "She never would have left without calling me. Never." Their pain, palpable and grounded, stood in stark contrast to Joseph's composed but sparse explanations. His interviews with police grew more evasive, not aggressive, but flat, emotionless, rehearsed. He insisted Emily had left after an argument, walked away into the woods and simply vanished. He never said he feared for her safety. He never asked about search parties. He never offered to help look. There was no urgency in his account, no desperation, only detachment. It didn't sit right with detectives. Experience had taught them something crucial. When the person closest to the missing victim shows no emotional investment in the outcome, it's rarely a coincidence. So they kept pushing. They asked him to repeat the story. They watched for timeline errors. They monitored his language. And what they began to see wasn't just inconsistency, it was fracture. Joseph's narrative was coming apart under the weight of its own vagueness. A key moment came when asked what Emily had been wearing when she left. He hesitated, then guessed. The kind of hesitation you don't expect from someone who just saw their spouse walk away into the woods. It was a detail that should have been seared into memory. Instead, it was a blank space. That blank space became the catalyst. Vermont authorities requested access to the camper van, not just to search, but to reconstruct. They suspected the answer to Emily's disappearance wasn't lost in the forest. It was in the very vehicle the couple had traveled in. At this point, Joseph remained a person of interest, not a suspect. But that line is thin in missing persons cases where one party is completely unaccounted for and the other remains the only source of information. Emily wasn't just missing. She had disappeared without digital trace, physical sighting, or logical explanation. And all roads, GPS, timeline, and behavior were beginning to point inward. When law enforcement examines a vehicle in a missing persons case, it's rarely just about finding fingerprints or stains. It's about uncovering the narrative a person refuses to speak. The camper Joseph and Emily Ferlazzo traveled in wasn't just transportation. It had become a sealed environment, untouched by the outside world, and it would soon reveal more truth than any spoken testimony. Vermont State Police coordinated with New Hampshire authorities to execute a search warrant. By that point, suspicion wasn't speculative. It was structured. Too many discrepancies, too many hours unaccounted for. The camper was no longer just a vehicle of interest. It had become the focal point of a developing homicide investigation. The first clue wasn't hidden. It was the smell. Investigators noticed it as soon as the rear doors opened. Not the scent of food left out too long or laundry forgotten, but something denser. It clung to the air, low and sour, difficult to describe but impossible to dismiss. The kind of scent that raises instinctive alarms. Forensic teams entered methodically, documenting the interior before touching a single object. Photographs captured every item: stacked clothes, used dishes, cleaning supplies, a bathroom with signs of recent scrubbing, and traces of what might have been bleach. But even bleach doesn't erase everything, not from trained eyes. Beneath the camper's small bathroom sink, forensic luminol testing lit up blue, a vibrant reaction, evidence of blood, cleaned but not invisible. Multiple areas in the bathroom showed the same result. It was clear someone had attempted to sanitize the space, but the outline of a crime lingers, especially when the perpetrator isn't a professional. In one corner, wrapped tightly inside black trash bags, investigators found what initially looked like debris, but inside, they discovered human remains. No longer just traces. Now, they had a body, partially dismembered, stored in the very space meant to be shared by two people celebrating their wedding anniversary. DNA testing would later confirm what was already suspected. The remains belonged to Emily Ferlazzo. This wasn't an accidental death. It wasn't a spontaneous act followed by panic. It was a series of deliberate decisions, one after the other, to conceal, manipulate, and control the outcome. Law enforcement noted not only the presence of remains, but the attempt to contain and transport them. This wasn't someone fleeing in grief. This was someone staying close, waiting for the moment to decide what to do next. For detectives, the challenge wasn't simply building a case, it was understanding the timeline. How long had the body been stored? What was the exact moment things went from verbal conflict to irreversible violence? To piece that together, they turned to GPS data. The camper's onboard system, like most modern vehicles, logged its route. Investigators traced the trip back to a remote area near Bolton, a patch of forest far from the main road, out of sight. The data showed the vehicle had stopped there for several hours during the night of October 16th, then resumed movement without explanation. It aligned with the time Emily was last seen. No camera footage captured the camper's actions in the forest. No eyewitnesses passed by. But the combination of the bathroom scene, the GPS delay, and Joseph's inconsistent timeline closed any gap for alternate explanations. Still, protocol mattered. Police had not yet announced Emily was deceased. The public still believed she was missing. That narrative had to remain in place until charges were filed, out of respect for the family and the integrity of the investigation. Internally, however, law enforcement now treated the case as a homicide. They continued to search the camper in detail. Additional blood evidence was found on a pillow, and several bags contained clothing with red-brown staining. Items had been washed, but not well enough. Textile fibers trapped remnants. Forensic vacuuming pulled out microscopic traces, biological material that no amount of scrubbing could erase. What investigators saw wasn't just a violent aftermath. It was a deliberate attempt to control perception. The crime didn't end at the act of killing. It extended into the days after, in the decisions about what to hide and what to reveal. In this case, what wasn't said told the story louder than anything else. Beyond evidence, there was meaning. The idea that a young woman, traveling with the person she trusted most, could be harmed and concealed inside the very space meant for freedom and peace was deeply unsettling. The camper was supposed to be an escape from daily life. Instead, it became a trap, a crime scene on wheels, parked in quiet neighborhoods while carrying the truth that no one yet knew. Law enforcement knew time was limited. Once confronted with evidence, people either confess or flee. They needed to act before the window closed. By now, Emily's parents were informed privately of the discovery. The public still waited for confirmation. But for investigators, the shift had happened. This was no longer a question of finding someone. It was a matter of proving what had already occurred and making sure justice followed. There is a moment in nearly every investigation when silence becomes unsustainable, not because the suspect speaks first, but because the evidence begins to speak louder than any denial can withstand. In the case of Emily Ferlazzo, that moment had arrived. By the time law enforcement confirmed that the human remains found in the camper belonged to Emily, the dynamic of the investigation shifted permanently. No longer a search for a missing woman, the case had entered the territory of homicide, and although Joseph Ferlazzo had not yet been publicly named as a suspect, he stood as the only person with knowledge of what had occurred during those crucial hours in Bolton. Detectives didn't confront him immediately. Instead, they studied his timeline, his digital footprints, and his movements. The idea wasn't to catch him in a lie. It was to let his own inconsistencies unravel the narrative he was trying to maintain. They began by revisiting his initial statements. Joseph had said Emily left the camper after an argument around 1 a.m. He claimed she walked into the woods and didn't return. But GPS records showed that the vehicle had been parked in a secluded location for an extended period of time, roughly 4 hours, with no cell activity, no messages sent, and no movement from either person. Afterward, the camper began traveling again, this time without any recorded stops, directly back toward New Hampshire. That simple contradiction, claiming she walked away, yet never calling for help, never contacting family, and never being seen again, was enough to elevate concern into actionable suspicion. But detectives didn't rely on theory. They moved methodically. Data extraction from Joseph's phone revealed browsing history that raised more questions than answers. Searches related to cleaning agents, disposal methods, and how long it takes for a body to decompose in a confined space appeared shortly after the trip to Vermont. While none of this alone proved intent, the accumulation of context painted a darker picture. It suggested forethought. It suggested planning, or at the very least, a disturbing reaction after the fact. The tone of the investigation changed. Joseph was invited in for another voluntary interview. This time, the questions weren't casual. Detectives pressed timelines, asked about inconsistencies, and presented parts of the forensic evidence. Not all, just enough to make it clear that they were closing in. Joseph responded with visible discomfort, no longer offering smooth responses. He hesitated. He avoided eye contact. He stammered through explanations that had previously come rehearsed. His narrative was no longer holding. Eventually, he stopped talking entirely. At this point, the case moved quickly. The remains in the camper had been positively identified as Emily Ferlazzo through DNA. The state medical examiner confirmed cause of death: gunshot wounds to the head, multiple, at close range. That finding was pivotal. It contradicted any theory of accidental death. It removed ambiguity. A close-range shooting followed by concealment was not a mistake. It was an execution followed by intentional cover-up. With that information secured, detectives obtained a warrant for Joseph Ferlazzo's arrest. When officers arrived to detain him, there was no resistance. He didn't run, he didn't protest. But what followed stunned even the most seasoned among them. In custody, when presented with the evidence and told of the findings, Joseph broke down, not emotionally, not with sorrow, but with cold precision. In a signed confession, he admitted to shooting Emily inside the camper while she was lying down. The details were blunt. He used a handgun. He fired twice. He waited. Then he began to dismember her body, storing parts in the camper's bathroom compartment. He claimed he panicked. He claimed she had insulted him during the argument. But panic doesn't carry out methodical concealment. Panic doesn't research decomposition or scrub surfaces with bleach. What Joseph described wasn't the chaos of loss, it was the control of removal. What the investigators heard wasn't remorse, it was resignation. In the interview room, his words carried no weight of grief, no hint of horror for what had transpired. He told the truth, yes, but not as a man burdened by guilt, rather as someone who knew the story had ended and there was nothing more to hold on to. Emily's parents were informed. The community reacted with a mixture of heartbreak and fury. The woman who had once posted about her excitement for the future, who had been planning to resume her career, was gone, taken not by accident or misfortune, but by a calculated act, committed in silence, covered up until the truth surfaced through persistence and science. Law enforcement knew that this case, while resolved in terms of finding the perpetrator, would echo beyond the courtroom. It was a sobering reminder of how intimate violence can exist undetected. There were no restraining orders, no documented abuse, no warning signs visible to the public. But in hindsight, there were quiet markers: isolation, control, a shrinking social circle, suppressed anxiety masked behind smiles. In the aftermath, many asked the same question: why? Why would someone harm the person they chose to marry? Why did she stay? Why didn't anyone see it coming? The answers were neither simple nor clean. Relationships that turn deadly often begin with subtle erosion, not punches or threats, but decisions that strip autonomy and distance victims from support. Emily, like many others in emotionally coercive relationships, believed it could get better. She believed love might be enough to change the trajectory. She believed the man she married would one day become the partner she hoped for. By the time she realized that wouldn't happen, it was too late. By the end of 2024, the quiet corners of Vermont were once again pulled into the spotlight. Nearly 3 years after Emily Ferlazzo's life was taken, during what was supposed to be a peaceful anniversary trip, her name returned to the headlines. Not as a victim in an unsolved case, but as the center of a courtroom battle between accountability and denial. Joseph Ferlazzo, now formally charged with first-degree murder, faced trial in a Vermont courtroom. The charges weren't based on speculation or circumstantial assumptions. Investigators had uncovered not just physical evidence, but a confession, a detailed admission of guilt. Yet under the law, confessions don't end trials. They begin them. The prosecution presented their case with precision. They laid out the timeline. Emily had been shot at close range while inside their camper, her body then dismembered and stored, and her family misled in the days that followed. Forensic specialists described the gunshot wounds. Analysts confirmed the weapon used. Cleaning materials recovered from the camper were introduced as evidence of a calculated attempt to conceal the crime. But beyond the evidence, the prosecution highlighted the human cost. Emily's life wasn't just lost, it was erased in silence, transported back across state lines and concealed for days. That, they argued, was not the action of someone in shock. It was the behavior of someone trying to escape responsibility. The defense took a different route. Joseph's attorney described a troubled relationship, one that allegedly involved emotional friction and instability on both sides. They claimed Joseph acted in self-defense, that Emily had become aggressive, and in a moment of fear, he pulled the trigger. They argued that his actions afterward, though disturbing, stemmed from panic, not planning. Joseph himself took the stand. He recounted the night of the shooting with a detached tone. He claimed Emily had threatened him, that she had access to a firearm, and he acted instinctively. But under cross-examination, his story wavered. He had never mentioned self-defense in his original interviews. He had left the scene. He had not contacted police, and he had carefully packed away the evidence of his actions. The jury listened. They reviewed text messages Joseph sent to Emily's phone after she was already deceased. They heard from law enforcement officers who found the remains. They watched the contradictions unfold, not just in the words Joseph said, but in the order of actions he chose once Emily was gone. Testimony from Emily's family brought the courtroom to stillness. Her mother described the last phone call, her daughter's quiet hopes for healing, and the moment she knew something had gone horribly wrong. She didn't ask the court for vengeance. She asked for truth, for her daughter to be seen not as a case number, but as a person who deserved more than to vanish without explanation. After 5 days of testimony and 2 days of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict: guilty of murder in the first degree. The courtroom did not erupt. It fell silent, as if the weight of the decision demanded stillness. The law had spoken. Joseph would face a minimum of 35 years in prison. For many, it would be the closest thing to justice that could be reached. But even then, justice could not undo what had been done. It could not rewrite the story of a young woman who believed in redemption, who hoped for change, and who never imagined her trust would be the thing that killed her. This chapter of the case brought closure to the legal system. But for the people who knew Emily, the sentence didn't end the grief. It confirmed it. What was lost wasn't just a life. It was the future she was building, and the voice she never got to raise. In the final weeks of winter, nearly 3.5 years after Emily Ferlazzo's life was extinguished in the most private of spaces, the legal system prepared to close a chapter that had weighed heavily on Vermont's conscience. The trial was over. The verdict had been delivered. All that remained was the sentencing. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was subdued, not triumphant, not vindictive, but heavy. A sense of exhaustion lingered in the air, the kind that follows relentless tragedy. Joseph Ferlazzo sat emotionless, as he had through most of the trial, awaiting the court's decision on how long he would spend behind bars for taking the life of his wife. There were no more arguments to be made. The facts had already been laid bare: the 2 gunshots, the methodical concealment, the attempt to manipulate perception afterward. His own confession, given not under duress but with deliberate clarity, left little room for interpretation. Yet sentencing is never merely about what was done. It is about recognizing what was lost and acknowledging the pain left behind. The judge listened as Emily's family spoke. Her mother stepped forward, voice trembling but unwavering. She didn't recount the forensic details or the courtroom drama. She talked about Emily's smile, her quiet resilience, the time she spent volunteering, the years she'd planned for, the future she never got to build. Every word delivered was a reminder that the victim in this case was not just a name on a court docket, but a full, breathing person whose life had been interrupted in the most senseless way. Other family members and friends followed, each adding another layer to who Emily was: a daughter, a friend, a dreamer, a woman who believed in second chances. Their testimonies weren't simply emotional releases, they served as warnings. The danger doesn't always come in the form of strangers, and that emotional control, left unaddressed, can escalate into irreversible destruction. The prosecution emphasized the deliberate nature of Joseph's choices, not just the moment of violence, but the days that followed: returning to New Hampshire, maintaining a story, sending messages to Emily's phone to fabricate a timeline. They argued that these were not actions of a man overtaken by panic. These were the choices of someone who sought to erase accountability. The defense acknowledged guilt but asked the court to consider Joseph's mental state. They spoke of stress, fear, emotional instability, and his lack of prior criminal history. They asked for a sentence that would allow for the possibility of redemption decades into the future. But in the end, the law did what it was designed to do. Joseph Ferlazzo was sentenced to life in prison with a mandatory minimum of 35 years before parole could be considered. The courtroom remained still as the words were spoken. There was no visible reaction from Joseph, no outburst, no collapse, just quiet acceptance, as if he had already resigned himself to this outcome long before it was official. The sentence did not restore what was taken. It never does. But it marked the conclusion of a process that began with a single report of a missing woman and ended with a formal acknowledgement of her stolen life. For Emily's family, there was no celebration. There was only the reality of absence, permanent, unfixable, but no longer hidden behind silence or doubt. In the weeks that followed, conversations extended beyond the courtroom. Local and national discussions turned toward the nature of domestic violence, how often it operates in the shadows, how easily it's missed until it's too late. Emily's case didn't just become a lesson in law enforcement procedure. It became a call for awareness. Her name now appears in conversations about prevention, her story told in workshops, schools, and advocacy groups focused on intervention. Her mother has since spoken publicly, not just to express grief, but to honor her daughter's life by helping others recognize the early signs of emotional manipulation and escalating control. In losing Emily, her family has chosen to amplify her memory through purpose. What Joseph Ferlazzo did was irreversible. The court's ruling was final. But the broader impact of this case continues, not in the pursuit of punishment, but in the hope that sharing this story might save someone else from the same ending. After the verdict and sentencing, the courtroom emptied, cameras turned away, journalists filed their final stories. But for the people closest to Emily Ferlazzo and for those who had followed every step of the case, silence didn't return. Instead, something else filled the space left behind. A growing awareness that this wasn't just the story of one crime, but a mirror reflecting a wider pattern hidden in plain sight. In the weeks that followed the sentencing, community forums, local advocacy centers, and domestic violence shelters in Vermont and beyond reported a quiet surge in calls, walk-ins, and requests for counseling. Women, and in some cases, men, sought answers to questions they had been afraid to ask. Is this normal? Could it happen to me? What does control look like before it becomes violence? Emily's case became part of public dialogue not because of its brutality alone, but because of how ordinary everything had seemed before it turned fatal. A young couple, a road trip, smiles on social media, then nothing. Survivors who had once felt isolated saw themselves in the quiet red flags buried in the story. Conversation shifted from reactive to preventive. Instead of only asking how Emily died, many asked how she had lived and whether different systems, responses, or signs might have made a difference. Local media didn't sensationalize the aftermath. Instead, many outlets focused on constructive reporting, examining the gaps in support services, interviewing trauma counselors, and challenging long-held assumptions about what abuse should look like. Experts in psychology and criminal behavior stepped forward to explain why coercive control often flies under the radar until it's too late. Schools, particularly in the Northeast, quietly began updating curriculum on emotional well-being and healthy relationships, not because of one case, but because this one had left an impression that facts alone couldn't erase. Community centers held open forums, and domestic violence organizations, many chronically underfunded, received a temporary uptick in donations, outreach, and volunteers. Emily's mother continued speaking publicly, but with a shift in focus. Her grief was constant, but she now used her voice to advocate for awareness, not sympathy. She didn't speak in dramatic terms. She spoke clearly, directly, and with purpose, to help people recognize what silence and isolation can become when ignored. But the reality remained sobering. No new law was passed. No national task force was formed. What changed was quieter than legislation. It was perception. For every person who heard Emily's name and paused, reconsidered a relationship, or reached out for support, a subtle shift took place. It was not a revolution, but it was not nothing. The story of what happened in that camper near Bolton would always be a tragedy, but what followed revealed something deeper. When a story is told plainly, without distortion or spectacle, it can still move people to look inward and act outward. Some stories end with a verdict, others with a sentence. But in cases like Emily Ferlazzo's, the true ending is harder to define. What remains isn't just the memory of the crime or the headlines that followed, it's the afterimage, the lingering imprint of a life interrupted and the quiet questions left behind. Emily was not famous. She wasn't part of any system that failed on paper. There were no ignored restraining orders, no police calls gone unanswered, no viral cries for help. What happened to her happened in silence, in private, behind closed doors that once seemed safe. That's what makes her story different and more haunting. It didn't begin in a courtroom. It began in the moments no one saw. That is why, even after the trial closed and justice was technically served, her case still echoes. Because it asks us to pay attention to the subtle, to understand that danger doesn't always shout, it often whispers. In the form of isolation, control, dismissal, and diminishing confidence. Abuse doesn't always bruise. Sometimes it erodes quietly until it leaves someone too trapped to leave. The legal system worked in this case, but laws alone can't protect people from relationships where control masquerades as care. Institutions react to damage. They rarely prevent it. That's where culture comes in. That's where community matters. That's where conversations, uncomfortable but necessary, have the power to intervene before violence ever begins. Emily's story reminds us that true crime is not just about crime. It's about people, about the way lives move from hope to harm when no one is watching closely enough, and about the responsibility each of us holds, not just to punish what's wrong, but to notice what doesn't feel right. For every case that ends in conviction, there are others that end in silence. Let this one not fade into that category. Let it be a marker, not of how someone died, but of how we choose to respond while others are still living. If there's one legacy to be taken from this, let it be vigilance, not paranoia, not judgment, but presence. The kind of presence that listens when someone says, "I'm fine," and still pays attention. The kind that hears hesitation and asks again. The kind that sees beyond the surface and recognizes that sometimes the most urgent stories are the ones no one is telling yet. Emily Ferlazzo will not speak again, but what her story revealed must continue to speak for her and for others still at risk of becoming silent. Thank you for watching our video. Please subscribe, follow us, and leave a comment. It truly helps us keep bringing you gripping and thought-provoking true crime stories.